Remember Shank? Shank, developed by Canadian masterminds Clay Entertainment, eventually published by EA. The side-scrolling grindhouse action pulp fest starring a young Danny Trejo pastiche with inverted facial hair.
Number 6.
Marsha!
Shut up, Mom! 1, 2, 3.
No? Shank? Nobody? I guess I shouldn't be surprised. Xbox Live Arcade was positively replete with excellent throwbacks. You had the retro platformers, of course, you had the beat-em-ups and the shoot-em-ups, all harkening back to the glory days of 8 and 16-bit gaming. Shank has a little bit of all three in its veins, but it did stand out at the time, at least to me, because of its striking comic book art style and stylish, smooth animations. Developers Clay, who you may know for sales behemoth Don't Starve or toilet drainage simulator Oxygen Not Included, were yet untested when Shank released, with only a few small games to their name. Shank was different, glossy, polished, cinematic, and it bore the iconic graphic novel stylization that characterizes the studio's output even now. It's pretty impressive in retrospect, the decisive vision Shank communicates even in its first few seconds of gameplay. This is a gore-slick gumbo, equal parts Tarantino, Samurai Jack, Shinobi 3, and Double Dragon made to order. The eponymous protagonist starts off armed to the teeth, and the violence only escalates from there, letting you weave together combos that blend chainsaws, machetes, Uzis, pistols, and of course shanks, into a whirlwind of crowd-punishing pain. The game also features a pulp-heavy plot, penned by God of War writer Marianne Gravchik, with cutscenes that shine a spotlight on the game's unique look, masterminded by mainstay Clay artist Jeff Agala. There's the makings of something truly great in Shank, at least from the outside, but when the game released it did so to a chorus of hems, haws, and lukewarm reviews. Good, not good enough, critics seem to say, citing the game's failure to feel quite as good as it looked. Didn't stop the game from selling, of course, and I gleefully snapped it up when I had the opportunity. That muscle-bound brand of juvenile revenge power fantasy was just my cup of tea, and it still is. So I'd like to take a look back at Shank, find out why the hype died, and rediscover a bit of bloody mayhem along the way.
I have failed in the eyes of God. Forgive me, Father, for I will sin.
I should call you Lazarus.
I should call you
Fucking dick!
Shank begins with, well, blood. The opening cutscene hands you a righteous motivation and enough sharp objects to cancel the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade, and you're off to the races. You'll immediately notice that for a beat-em-up, this game makes use of a lot of the buttons on your controller. You've got your Shanky light attack, which auto-combos and minces most enemies with ease. A chainsaw for your heavy attack, which dishes out huge amounts of stun and deeps, but is naturally much slower. And dual pistols, which excel at long range, can fire in two directions at once, and can extend combos on downed enemies. And let me just say, the game feels silky right off the bat. Shank flies across the screen like a slap-happy sugar glider, busting skulls and taking names in the dozens. There's a natural flow from light attack to heavy attack to launcher to air attacks to range attacks, or whatever feels right, man. It's very freeform. You can also grab onto goons and choke the daylights out of them, or use Shank's signature leaping pounce to, kind of do the same thing, but you jump really high before you do it, so that's pretty cool. You also have grenades, which straight up invalidate any enemy you throw them at, sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card for any enemy varietals you'd rather not deal with. Combine this with the twitchy dodge roll, which is pretty generous with its invincibility frames, and you have a character that feels suitably overprepared for the ensuing carnage. But it's not long before your arsenal triples in size. The shanks are non-negotiable, presumably for branding reasons, but the chainsaw can be traded up for machetes, a katana, and iron chain-link hand wraps, while the pistols can be swapped for a shotgun or Uzi. And it's not like it's a one-and-done loadout type situation, no. Each of these weapons can be swapped between mid-combo with the D-pad. The mystery of Shank's bottomless pockets aside, this is a fantastic feeling setup once you get a feel for the myriad button combinations you'll be wrangling. Really, I can't see how anyone said that Shank lacks fluidity. I understand the game was touched up a bit after release, so it may have something to do with that, but as it is, Shank is tremendously satisfying in its moment-to-moment action. If the game excels at anything, it is that. Polish and fluid controls. That rush of velvety animations effortlessly bleeding one into the next is just intoxicating. But novelty only carries the game so far, right? So how is the combat in a practical sense? Well, each weapon represents a trade-off between speed, damage, reach, and stun. The chain fists, for example, deal good damage up close and give your grabs new capabilities, but they lack the AoE crowd management skills of the wide-load dual machetes. The Uzi, on the other hand, piles on lethal combo hits for days, but can't match the shotgun's ability to do this shit. Yeah, Shank is quite fun, but is a little generous with the hit stun. I can see a real combo fiend just tearing through this game without breaking a sweat. There are a ton of ways to lock down your enemies and just deny them the chance to act at all. Enemies do their damnedest to swarm you, whether armed with guns, a shield, or just a huge, large body, but the freedom with which you can roll and leap and lunge and shank means it won't be long before they're a fine red mist. But of course, that's the fun of any beat-em-up game, right? Progressing your skills to the point where you can break the game over your knee. And really, I enjoy how accessible Shank is in that regard. The game's normal mode is quite welcoming, and it doesn't punish you much for failure. Checkpoints abound, and you're constantly raking in grenades and health pickups. You also occasionally score powerful temporary weapons, like the minigun, which just let you slaughter enemies in droves as long as you have them. All this makes it clear that Shank is a power fantasy first, and everything else second, and the game's modest challenge lets you explore the combo system and self-express in a way that most pleases your bloodthirsty lizard brain, the id which craves violence and McDonald's and ketamine. By the end of the game's meager 3-hour runtime, you'll have a vice grip on the game's systems. In fact, it'll almost feel like things should just be getting started, and if you're into hard mode, then they are. Hard mode is structured much more like something like Streets of Rage. Tougher enemies and no checkpoints. You'll have to watch your own hide somewhat, since enemies are a good deal more threatening, and death is a much scarier prospect, even with the short stages. Nobody likes lost progress. If that doesn't sound too bad to you, I do recommend playing on hard. It feels a bit more like the intended difficulty, if that makes sense. One big difference this game has from games like Double Dragon and Final Fight, which it harkens back to, is that you're on a single plane rather than an open environment where you can walk around. Of course, there's much more happening in the air than in those games, as this does have some gentle platforming in it, and the dodge roll kind of evens out the difficulty in that regard, but it bears mentioning. This isn't a one-for-one recreation. Another place Shank strives to innovate is with the boss fights, and really I don't care for them. They're pretty undercooked in my eyes. They almost resemble Mario bosses or something, where you need to be on the lookout for some canned moment of vulnerability before you can actually hit them or, do much damage. It just breaks up the pace immensely. The final fight is something of an exception and manages to be quite tense, but the other ones felt dispensable. I think they would have been better even as just hordes of really tough enemies, or, in Streets of Rage or Golden Axe, a boss would just be a really big guy with a big health bar. Might sound boring, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Overall, I think Shank's gameplay shines bright and burns fast, so to speak, but it would have needed more if the game was going to be any longer. At its length, though, of around 3 hours for a single playthrough, it works well. If you need a game to act as a virtual stress ball for an afternoon, you could do significantly worse than Shank. Of course, Shank does contextualize things a little bit more than that. So how is the story? Well, it's fine, but it's about as minimal as you might expect. Something worth noting here is that there's 2 cuts of Shank's plot, with the original version of the game having a much darker, more violent story that the devs eventually went back on. It handles, or maybe mishandles, some sensitive topics which I won't delve into too much here, but if you really want to experience it, the option does exist on Steam. The current retail version of Shank features an abridged story with shorter cutscenes and fewer gruesome details. The beats remain the same though, and the beats are very simple. Shank's in the wrong crowd, said crowd murders his lady love, and he's out for revenge against every bastard responsible. It's not exactly original, but again, it is an homage to Grindhouse. The problem is that it's pretty boring. There are a couple really entertaining one-liners, but beyond that, Shank isn't much of a character, right? He's a vessel for your gamer rage. That's perfectly fine, obviously, as plot isn't the main course here. But if you're gonna have cutscenes, they may as well say something, right? Or at least lean into that pulpy cheese a bit more. There's also a twist in the last 15 minutes of the game, which hardly feels like a twist at all. The game drops this apparent bombshell on you with all this gusto, and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. I kind of assumed that was the case. I view the paper-thin plot more as a missed opportunity than any active malady on the game. An opportunity not missed, though, is presentation. We've talked about the slick animations, but the hand-drawn characters are no slouch either. The designs are fun. in a word, and Agala's art just shines. The sort of Venture Brothers veneer in this game didn't exactly carry over to Clay's future work, which helps give Shank its own visual identity in their catalog. Kind of feels like something you might see on Adult Swim back in the day. Music fares pretty well too. It's nothing that'll knock your socks off, but the sanguine guitar jams and weary strings provide a nice dramatic contrast to the insane, gory visual mayhem. Have a listen. So yeah, overall I think Shank is pretty great. It's like a 4-piece chicken nuggets. Sure, there's not much to it, and it's gone a little too quickly, but it still tastes pretty freaking good. So why does nobody talk about this damn thing? Maybe the mixed critical reception clipped its wings a bit early somehow, or perhaps it's just overshadowed by the excellent Don't Starve and Mark of the Ninja, both of which were vastly more successful for Clay. Personally, I think it's a standout action game from the beginning of the 2010s, and one of the better beat-em-ups on Xbox Live Arcade. Do I recommend Shank? Well, maybe. If you're into beat-em-ups and action platformers, I think you will find this to be a very entertaining couple of hours. However, it is just a couple of hours, so if your $10 US or regional equivalent is worth more to you than that, maybe hold off or wait for a sale. Clay's off to bigger and better things these days, and that's great, but I really wouldn't mind if one day they gave Shank another look and let me dust off the old chainsaw, and chain fists, and machetes, and Uzi, and pistols, and shotgun. Thanks for watching.